Your daughter needs a father, and I need children. That's what the mountain man said. Standing in the rain, water running down his hat brim, eyes set like granite. She was a widow, clutching her little girl, turned out into the mud with nowhere to go. The church bell tolled, and folks on the boardwalk stopped to stare. No courtship. No sweet words. Just a bargain struck under a leaking roof because the child was coughing too hard to stand. But what she didn't know was that her dead husband's land held the only spring in the valley, and the men who wanted it would burn barns, break doors, and leave the snow red if it meant control. Now, a woman who never thought she'd marry again rides with a man who never thought he'd take a wife, both bound to a promise made in desperation. Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The October rain fell in heavy sheets, turning Elk Crossing's main street into a muddy river. Water pooled in deep puddles between the wagon ruts, reflecting the gray sky above. Mara. Collins drew her worn wool shawl tighter around herself and her daughter Annie, but it did little to ward off the bone-chilling damp. "Please, Mrs. Kerrigan," Mara said, her voice steady despite the desperation clawing at her chest. "Just one more week. The money from the laundry work is coming. I've heard that tale before." Mrs. Kerrigan's face hardened as she blocked the boarding house doorway. 3 weeks behind is 3 weeks too many. I'm running a business, not a charity. Annie pressed closer to Mara's side, her small frame racked by a deep cough that seemed to come from her very bones. The sound tore at Mara's heart. "But my daughter, she's sick. We have nowhere else to go. Then I suggest you find somewhere quick. Good day, Mrs. Collins." The door closed with a final sounding thud. Mara guided Annie onto the boardwalk, trying to shelter her from the worst of the rain. The church bell began to toll 6, each resonant strike echoing off the wet buildings. 1, 2, 3, each. Toll felt like judgment, counting down their last moments of having a roof over their heads. The clip-clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels drew her attention to the street. A heavily loaded wagon approached through the rain, its bed piled high with beaver pelts. The driver, a tall man with broad shoulders, pulled his team to a stop near the water trough. Mara recognized him vaguely. Caleb Stroud, the mountain man who came to town a few times a year to trade furs. She'd seen him at a distance, but never spoken to him. He had a reputation for being honest in his dealings, if not particularly social. Annie's cough broke the silence again, the sound harsh and worrying. Mara rubbed her daughter's back, murmuring soft words of comfort, though comfort felt far away at that moment. She became aware of boots on the boardwalk and looked up to find Caleb Stroud standing before them. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he studied them with clear gray eyes. His expression was difficult to read, but there was something gentle in the way he looked at Annie. "Your daughter needs a father," he said without preamble, his voice low and steady. "And I need children." Mara stared at him, scandalized by the forwardness of his words. "Mr. Stroud, I hardly know you." "No, you don't," he agreed. "But I've got a good homestead up near Beaver Creek. Clean air might help that cough. Plenty of food, warm shelter." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm not much for fancy words, ma'am, but I'd be a good husband to you and a father to your girl." Mara took a step back, pulling Annie with her. "You can't be serious. Pastor Matthews is still in the church." Caleb continued, nodding toward the white-clapboard building. "We could do it proper right now." Another bout of coughing seized Annie, so violent she nearly doubled over. Mara held her daughter close, feeling the heat of fever through the thin dress. They had no money, no home, and Annie needed medicine. Pride warred with maternal desperation in her chest. She looked up at Caleb Stroud. His face was weathered from years in the mountains, but his eyes were kind. There was no hint of deceit in his expression, just simple honesty. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do this?" "Been alone too long," he answered. "Watched too many good folks struggle when I could help. Besides," he added, a slight softness entering his voice, "every child deserves a chance at a good life." Annie's small hand clutched at Mara's skirt. "Mama, I'm cold," she whispered. Mara looked down at her daughter's pale face, then back at Caleb. The rain continued to fall, but he stood patient and steady, waiting for her answer. This wasn't how she'd imagined marriage, not this desperate bargain struck on a rainy street. But Annie's needs had to come first. She drew in a deep breath and nodded once, sharply. "Yes," she said, the word barely audible above the rain. "Yes, I'll marry you." Something like relief crossed Caleb's face. He gestured toward the church, then shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it over Annie's shoulders. The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes, but didn't shrink away. "Much obliged," he said quietly, and led them toward the church door. The rain drummed on the church roof as Pastor Matthews listened to their request. His kind face creased with concern. But he saw the same things Mara had: Annie's illness, Caleb's sincerity, the practical necessity of the arrangement. Within minutes, he had them standing before the altar. The ceremony was brief and simple. Mara's fingers trembled as Caleb slipped a plain gold ring onto her finger. He'd pulled it from his pocket, apparently having carried it for some time. His large hands were gentle, and his "I do" was spoken with quiet certainty as Pastor Matthews pronounced them husband and wife. Mara glanced at her new husband's profile in the lamplight. What kind of man married a stranger and her sick child on a rainy evening? Either a fool or a saint, she supposed. Time would tell which Caleb Stroud turned out to be. Annie coughed again, and Caleb's hand came to rest protectively on the little girl's shoulder. "Let's get you both home and dry," he said. "Got some medicine in my wagon, might help with that cough." Home. Such a simple word, but it caught in Mara's throat. Whatever came next, at least they wouldn't face it alone in the rain. The rain drummed steadily on the boardwalk as Caleb led them toward the church. Their boots made wet, squelching sounds against the muddy planks, and Annie huddled close to Mara's side, still wrapped in Caleb's oversized coat. The white clapboard building loomed ahead, its windows glowing with warm LAMPLIGHT. Reverend Pritchard looked up from his desk as they entered, water dripping from their clothes onto the wooden floor. His eyes widened at the sight of them. Mara. Colin soaked to the skin, little Annie pale and shivering, and Caleb Stroud's tall frame filling the doorway. "Caleb, Mrs. Collins?" The Reverend set down his pen. "What brings you out in weather like this?" "Me to be married, Reverend," Caleb said simply. "Tonight." The Reverend's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Tonight? But surely, child." "Needs a roof over her head," Caleb cut in, his voice firm but respectful. He nodded toward Annie, who punctuated his words with another rattling cough. "Can't wait on formalities." Reverend Pritchard studied them for a long moment, his kind eyes moving from Mara's determined face to Annie's trembling form to Caleb's steady gaze. Understanding dawned in his expression. "Very well," he said softly. "Come forward to the altar." The ceremony was brief, conducted in the quiet sanctuary, lit only by oil lamps. Rain pattered against the stained glass windows, creating shifting shadows on the wooden floors. Annie sat in the front pew, wrapped in Caleb's coat, while her mother stood before the altar. Mara's whispered vows were barely audible above the storm, her fingers clutching her sodden skirts. Water dripped from her hair onto her shoulders, but she held herself straight and proud. Annie watched with wide eyes as Caleb produced a simple gold ring and slipped it onto her mother's finger. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the only sound was the rain and Annie's occasional Cough. Caleb signed the marriage certificate with a steady hand, then helped Mara dip the pen in ink for her signature. Outside, Caleb draped his oilskin coat over Mara's shoulders. The streets were dark now, lit only by a few wavering lamps in shop windows. He led them to the livery stable where his wagon waited, the beaver pelts now covered with heavy tarpaulins. "Up you go," he said, lifting Annie onto the wagon seat as if she weighed nothing. He helped Mara up next, then climbed up himself and took the reins. The mules stamped their feet, eager to be moving. They left town in darkness, the wagon wheels groaning as they cut through the muddy road. Rain continued to fall, though lighter now, and Mara held Annie close against the damp chill. The child's breathing seemed easier in the fresh air, despite the wet. Their progress was slow. The usual route to Caleb's homestead led them to a creek crossing, but when they arrived, the usually placid stream had become a rushing torrent. "Creek's too high," Caleb said, studying the water in the dim light. "Have to take the long way round." He turned the wagon onto a less traveled trail that wound through the foothills. The detour added hours to their journey, and Annie fell into an uneasy sleep against her mother's shoulder. Mara stayed awake, watching the unfamiliar landscape pass. In the darkness, wondering what kind of home awaited them. It was well past midnight when Caleb finally drew the mules to a halt. Through the drizzle, Mara could make out the shape of a cabin, larger than she'd expected. A lamp burned in the window, its light spilling onto a wide porch. "Welcome home," Caleb said quietly, helping them down from the wagon. Inside, the cabin was clean and well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Caleb immediately set to building up a fire. The flames caught quickly, spreading warmth through the room. Simple furniture filled the space, a solid table with chairs, a cupboard filled with dishes, a rocking chair near the hearth. "Bedrooms through there," Caleb said, nodding toward a door. "Got fresh quilts in the chest. I'll sleep out here." He moved to the kitchen area, warming milk in a pan over the cookstove. Annie watched him with drowsy interest as he added a spoonful of honey and what smelled like herbs. "Old mountain remedy," he explained, handing the cup to Mara. "Might help with the cough." Annie sipped the warm milk, while Mara helped her into a clean nightgown from their hastily packed bag. The bed was piled with colorful quilts, and Annie snuggled down into them, her eyes already closing. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, listening as the storm began to fade. For the first time in days, Annie's breathing was easy and clear, no cough disturbing her rest. Through the open door, she could see Caleb settling himself on a pallet near the fire, his back to the bedroom. The strange day caught up with her all at once. The eviction, the sudden marriage, the long journey through the rain. Yet here they were, warm and dry, with a roof over their heads and Annie sleeping peacefully. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they had survived today. Outside, the rain softened to a gentle patter on the cabin's roof, a lullaby in the mountain. Night, morning crept over the mountains, painting the eastern sky in soft pink and gold. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the towering pines, revealing Caleb's homestead in clear detail. The log cabin stood sturdy and well-built, its stone chimney sending wisps of wood smoke curling into the crisp autumn air. Frost sparkled on the split-rail fence that enclosed the yard, and a pair of horses nickered softly in the corral. Inside, Mara woke to the sound of quiet movement in the main room. Annie still slept beside her, curled beneath the heavy quilts. The air held the warmth of a freshly stoked fire and the promising aroma of biscuits baking. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Caleb already at work. He stood at the iron cookstove, sliding golden brown biscuits onto a plate. A pot of coffee bubbled nearby, and thin slices of venison sizzled in a cast-iron skillet. "Morning," he said, nodding toward the table where he'd set 3 plates. Meats from last fall's hunt, kept well in the smokehouse. Thank you, Mara replied softly, conscious of her rumpled dress from yesterday. She moved to wake Annie, who stirred reluctantly and clung to her mother's skirts as they approached the table. The child's eyes darted nervously around the unfamiliar room, taking in the rough-hewn walls, decorated with dried herbs and a few tools. She stayed close to Mara as they sat down, watching Caleb with cautious interest. Caleb served the food without ceremony, then disappeared briefly into the back room. He returned with something small cupped in his weathered hands. "Made this some years back," he said, holding out a delicately carved wooden bird to Annie. The piece was simple but beautifully done, its wings lifted as if ready to take flight. "Thought you might like it." Annie glanced at her mother for permission, before reaching out to accept the gift. Her small fingers traced the smooth wooden feathers, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "What do we say, Annie?" Mara prompted gently. "Thank you, sir," Annie whispered, clutching the bird close. "Caleb will do," he replied, turning his attention to his plate dot after breakfast. Mara retrieved her carpet bag from beside the bed. Her entire life now fit in this single bag, 2 well-worn but carefully mended dresses, her mother's Bible with its cracked leather cover, and wrapped carefully in a soft shawl, a framed daguerreotype of Thomas, her late husband. She held the image for a moment, studying the serious young face captured in silver, before placing it carefully on the small table near the bed. "Might show you around the place," Caleb suggested, watching from the doorway. "If you're ready." The morning air was sharp with frost as they stepped outside. Caleb led them past the barn, where his mules stood in comfortable stalls, through the corrals where 2 horses gazed at them with interest, and down a path to a well-built root cellar dug into a hillside. "Store most of the winter provisions here," he explained, opening the heavy door. Inside, shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. Barrels of apples and potatoes sat in corners, and strings of dried herbs hung from the ceiling. "Creek helps keep it cool in summer." They followed him to the creek itself, its surface partially frozen in the morning chill. The water ran clear and swift between ice-rimmed banks. "Gets deeper in spring," Caleb said. "Good fishing then." The tour complete, they returned to the cabin. Caleb disappeared outside with an axe over his shoulder, and soon the steady thunk of wood being split echoed across the yard. Mara settled at the table with his mending basket, finding several shirts in need of attention. Annie sat nearby on a braided rug, still holding her wooden bird. She watched through the window as Caleb worked, his rhythm steady and sure as he built up a substantial pile of firewood. The day passed quietly as they each found their tasks. Mara worked through the mending, pleased to find she could be useful so quickly. The shirts were well made, but showed signs of bachelor care, with missing buttons and torn seams that her needle soon put right. When supper time arrived, Caleb brought in an armload of wood for the night. The evening meal was simple beans, cornbread, and more venison, but filling. As they ate, Annie's wooden bird sat beside her plate, and when Caleb explained how he'd carved it while snowed in one winter, the child's soft giggle broke the quiet. The unexpected sound made Caleb's mouth twitch, almost forming a smile. He covered it quickly by reaching for his coffee cup, but Mara had seen the brief softening of his weathered features. Later, after Annie had been tucked into bed, Mara found Caleb still at the table, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. She stood in the bedroom doorway, gathering her courage. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done for us. The shelter, the food, your kindness to Annie... Caleb's hands stilled on the rifle. He seemed to find it difficult to meet her eyes, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "We'll make it work," he said simply, with a short nod. Before returning to his task, Mara watched him for a moment longer, then slipped back into the bedroom, where Annie slept peacefully, the carved bird nestled in her arms. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness, and the creek murmured its endless song beneath its icy cover. 2 days slipped by in quiet routine at the mountain cabin. The morning frost had barely melted when hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Caleb paused in splitting wood, his axe held ready as he watched a lone rider approach. Mara stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Annie peeked around her skirts, clutching her wooden bird for comfort. The rider, dressed in a town coat despite the rugged terrain, pulled his horse to a stop. "Mr. Stroud?" he called out, fishing in his saddlebag. "Name's Clegg, from the courthouse. Got official business." Caleb set his axe against the chopping block and approached, boots crunching on frost-covered pine needles. Mr. Clegg extended a sealed envelope, the courthouse stamp pressed into red wax on its face. "Much obliged," Caleb said, taking the envelope. His weathered fingers broke the seal as Clegg shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Need to witness you reading it," the man explained, glancing at Mara. "Legal requirement being as it concerns. The widow Collins begging your pardon, Mrs. Stroud now." Mara's spine stiffened at the mention of her former name. She drew closer, Annie trailing behind her like a shadow. Caleb unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the formal writing. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, reading aloud for all to hear. Notice of default and pending transfer of property regarding the Collins Ranch and associated water rights, specifically the spring known as Coldwater Creek headwaters. He paused, looking at Mara. "Says here there's an unpaid note against the property, $200 owing." The color drained from Mariah's face. "But that land was worthless after Thomas died. The drought took everything. I sold what cattle survived to keep Annie fed." Caleb continued reading. "Payment in full required within 30 days, or title transfers to the holder of the note." His jaw tightened. "Horace Berryman." "Berryman?" Mara whispered, sinking onto the porch steps. "The cattle baron from Missouri?" Mr. Clegg cleared his throat. "He's been buying up water rights all through the territory. That spring on your old place? Only reliable water source for 10 miles in summer." Caleb folded the paper slowly, his expression darkening. "That spring feeds more than just cattle. Homesteaders downstream depend on it. The Dine families from the reservation water their sheep there. Ain't my business what Mr. Berryman plans," Clegg said, gathering his reins. "Just delivering the notice." 30 days, Mrs. Stroud. Good day to you all." He touched his hat brim and turned his horse, eager to be away from the tension hanging in the mountain air. Annie tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, are we going to have to leave again?" Her small voice trembled. The wooden bird clutched tight against her chest. Caleb crouched down to Annie's level, his voice gentle but firm. "Not if I can help it, little one." But when he straightened, his eyes had grown hard as mountain stone. Mara pressed her hands to her face. "I never knew about any note. Thomas handled all the papers, and after the stampede ... double quotes, she swallowed hard. Everything was such a blur. I thought I'd settled all our debts when I sold the cattle." "This isn't your doing," Caleb said quietly. "Berryman's known for finding old debts, buying them up cheap. Man's got a talent for turning paper into property. But $200 ... Mara's voice cracked. "Even if we sold everything, we won't be selling anything." Caleb's tone left no room for argument. He studied the notice again, his thumb running along the courthouse seal. "That spring's too important to let one man fence it off. Not just for us, for everyone down valley." Mara looked up at him, seeing the determination set into the lines of his face. "What can we do? First things first." He folded the notice carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. I'll ride into town tomorrow, talk to some folks who might know more about these papers Barryman's collecting. Annie's small hand found Caleb's rough one. Will you come back? The fear in her voice spoke of too many changes, too many losses in her young life. Caleb's fingers closed gently around hers. Count on it, child. This is your home now, both of you. He looked at Mara, his gaze steady. And I aim to keep it that way. The rest of the day passed in a haze of worry for Mara. She went through the motions of her chores feeding chickens, helping Caleb repair a loose shutter, preparing their evening meal, but her mind kept circling back to the notice. The thought of Barryman controlling that spring, of families going thirsty while cattle trampled the banks, made her stomach twist with guilt and fear. That evening, after Annie had gone to bed, Mara found Caleb at the table, the notice spread. Out before him in the lamplight, his finger traced the lines of legal writing, as if searching for some hidden answer in the formal phrases. I should have known, Mara said softly. Should have checked more carefully when Thomas died. Man like Barryman counts on people being too grieved to notice every paper. Caleb's voice was quiet but carried an edge of steel. He's been playing this game a long time. The spring was always good to us, Mara remembered. Even in the worst drought years. The Dine women would come with their sheep, and we'd share coffee while the animals drank. Their children played with Annie ... She blinked back tears. How can someone just take that away? He can't, Caleb said simply. Not yet. He carefully refolded the notice, his movements deliberate. We've got 30 days. And I've learned a few things about survival in these mountains. His words carried no bravado, just quiet certainty. Mara studied his profile in the lamplight, seeing the strength there, the determination that had kept him alive through winters and wars. For the first time since Clegg's arrival, she felt a glimmer of hope. Outside, a coyote called from the ridgeline, its voice rising lonely and wild. In the darkness, inside the cabin, Annie slept peacefully, her wooden bird keeping watch from the bedside table, while her parents faced the new challenge that threatened their fragile beginning. Dawn broke, crisp and clear over the mountain cabin. Caleb stood in the yard, adjusting the harness on his wagon team while frost crunched under his boots. The morning air bit sharp enough to make steam rise from the horse's flanks. Mara emerged from the cabin wrapped in her shawl, carrying a basket of biscuits for the journey. Annie followed, clutching her wooden bird and watching Caleb's sure movements. With the horses. Town's a fair piece, Caleb said, helping them up onto the wagon seat. Best we get an early start. The wagon creaked as they set out, wheels cutting through the morning frost. Annie nestled between them, her small shoulders gradually relaxing as the familiar sway of the wagon lulled her. Mara kept one arm around her daughter, her other hand gripping the seat as they navigated the winding mountain trail. The sun climbed higher as they descended into the valley, warming the air and melting the frost from the pines. By mid-morning, the first buildings of Elk Crossing came into view. The town seemed different to Mara, now less threatening than it had been just days ago when she and Annie had stood homeless on its streets. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. Best get supplies first, he said, helping them down. Then I'll head over to the courthouse. Inside the store, the bell above the door announced their arrival. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, looked up from her sweeping. Her eyes widened at the sight of Mara and Annie. Land sakes, if it ain't the new Mrs. Stroud, she said, leaning on her broom. Word travels fast in these parts. Though not as fast as Barryman's men, seems like. Mara paused in examining a bolt of calico. What do you mean? Mrs. Peterson glanced around, though the store was empty save for them. 2 of his riders were out by Coldwater Spring yesterday, making measurements and such. Talking about where? They put fencing once the property changes hands. She clucked her tongue. Ain't right, if you ask me. That spring's watered half the valley since before my Henry's daddy homesteaded here. Caleb's expression hardened as he loaded supplies into a crate: coffee, sugar, ammunition for his hunting rifle. Might be they're counting their chickens before they hatch. You be careful, Mr. Stroud, Mrs. Peterson warned. Berryman ain't known for taking kindly to folks who stand in his way. Outside, Caleb loaded their purchases into the wagon. You and Annie stay here, he told Mara. I'll see what I can learn at the courthouse. The courthouse stood at the end of the street, its weather-vaned roof reaching above the other buildings. Caleb climbed the wooden steps, boot heels echoing in the empty corridor. In the clerk's office, a thin man with ink-stained fingers barely looked up from his ledger. Need to see the original deed for the Collins Ranch, Caleb said. Property's got my wife's name on it now. The clerk shifted uncomfortably. Those records are temporarily unavailable. Mr. Berryman's lawyer has them under review. Review? Caleb's voice carried a dangerous quiet. Seems mighty convenient. I got my orders, the clerk said, still not meeting his eyes. Nothing to be done about it. Caleb turned to leave, his jaw set tight. As he stepped onto the courthouse porch, a familiar figure emerged from the shadow of a cottonwood tree. Brother, called a steady voice. It has been many seasons. Nanton. Caleb's face softened as he clasped hands with his old friend. The dying scout looked little changed from their army days, still straight-backed and dignified, though gray. Now threaded his black hair. Nanton's dark eyes studied Caleb's face. I heard you had returned to these mountains, and now you have taken a wife. Things change fast sometimes, Caleb admitted, though other things never seem to like men trying to steal what ain't theirs to take. Nanton nodded gravely. I have. Heard about Berryman's claim on Coldwater Spring. My people water their sheep there, as they have since before the treaties were signed. He glanced at the courthouse door. They refuse to show you the papers? Seems they're being reviewed. Come, Nanton said. We should talk where fewer ears listen. They walked to the shade of the cottonwood. Nanton spoke quietly, his words measured. That spring was marked in the old treaties protected water rights for both settlers and Dine. If Berryman's claim conflicts with treaty boundaries, he let the implication hang. Caleb's eyes narrowed. You're saying the claim might be worthless? If. We could prove it. Nanton gestured toward the courthouse. But the treaty records are locked in the county vault, and some men in power would prefer certain papers remain lost. A vault can be opened, Caleb said carefully. Nanton's expression remained neutral. There are those among my people who remember the old boundaries well. If evidence were found, supporting their memories, ... will quotes. He straightened. I must go, but I will be watching the spring. And brother, he gripped Caleb's arm, be cautious. Berryman's ambition runs deeper than water rights. Caleb found Mara and Annie still at the general store, where Annie was admiring a display of candies while Mara talked with Mrs. Peterson. The worry in Mara's eyes deepened when she saw his expression. Any luck? She asked as they walked back. To the wagon. Some, Caleb said. Met an old friend who might be able to help. He lifted Annie onto the wagon seat, then helped Mara up. But it won't be simple. Nothing worth fighting forever is, Mara said softly. Then, with more concern, Caleb, are you sure about this? Berryman has money, influence. We could just ... Run? He shook his head, climbing up beside them. That spring means life for too many people. Someone's got to stand against men like Berryman, or there won't be anything left worth having in these mountains. As they drove home, the sun sinking toward the western peaks, Annie fell asleep against Mara's shoulder. Mara watched the familiar landmarks past the lightning-struck pine, the red rock outcropping, the bend in the creek where wild roses grew. Each one spoke of home, of belonging. She reached over and squeezed Caleb's hand, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers. "Whatever you decide to do," she whispered, "careful not to wake Annie. We'll face it together." Caleb nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead as it wound up into the gathering dusk. The wagon creaked steadily homeward, while behind them, the town grew small in the valley's deepening shadows. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Caleb stood in the yard, squinting up at the barn's weathered roof. Loose shingles rattled in the mountain breeze, and dark patches showed where rain had worked its way through. He gathered his tools, hammer, nails, and fresh-cut shakes he'd been saving for repairs. Inside the cabin, Mara stirred a pot of beans that had soaked overnight. The air filled with the rich smell of salt pork and onions as she added seasonings. Her mind worked over their supplies, planning how to stretch them through the coming weeks. The pantry held enough dry goods, but fresh vegetables were scarce this late in the season. "Papa Caleb?" Annie's small voice came from the doorway. She'd taken to calling him that, testing the word carefully like stepping on new ice. He turned, hammer in hand. "Yes, little one? Can I help?" Caleb considered the child for a moment. "Reckon the roof's too steep for you yet, but I could use some company while I work on something else first." He led Annie to a clearing near the tree line, where rabbit tracks crossed in the frost-covered grass. Kneeling beside her, he pulled twine and smooth sticks from his pocket. "Watch close now," he said, demonstrating how to bend the flexible branch into a loop. "Rabbits, they got their favorite paths they follow. Set a snare just so, and I'll walk right into it." Annie's face scrunched in concentration as she tried to copy his movements. Her small fingers fumbled with the twine at first, but she kept at it until she had a passable snare. "That's right," Caleb encouraged. "Now, where do you reckon we should set it?" Annie studied the ground, then pointed to where several tracks converged near a thorny bush. "There. Good eye." He helped her place the snare, showing her how to secure it properly. They set 3 more together, Annie growing more confident with each one. The afternoon light was fading when they returned to the cabin. Through the window, they could see Mara sitting by the lamp, her Bible open on her lap. Her voice carried softly through the door as she read from Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want ... Annie hurried inside, cheeks pink from the cold. "Mama, I helped set snares. Papa Caleb says we might catch rabbits for stew." Mara looked up, smiling at her daughter's excitement. "That's wonderful, dear. Now wash up, supper's nearly ready." After they'd eaten and Annie was tucked into bed, Caleb and Mara sat at the table, speaking in low voices. The lamp cast dancing shadows on the log walls as they discussed their situation. 3 days each way to the county seat, Caleb said, tracing the route on a worn map. "Roads will be rough this time of year." Mara wrapped her shawl tighter. "We can't leave Annie here alone that long, not with winter coming on." "No," Caleb agreed. "She'll have to come with us. We'll pile blankets in the wagon bed, make her a nest to keep warm. It'll be hard traveling." Mara's fingers worried at a loose thread in her shawl. "But we need those treaty papers." Caleb nodded. 2 days to prepare. "I'll need to fix that roof first. Get enough feed set out for the livestock. I can dry more beef, pack provisions." Mara paused, then added softly, "Thank you, Caleb, for teaching Annie today. She's starting to trust you. She's a good girl." His voice was gruff with emotion he wasn't used to showing. Quick learner, too. They worked through the next 2 days with shared purpose. Caleb patched the roof while Mara preserved food and packed warm clothing. They moved around each other with growing familiarity, passing tools or supplies without need for words. Annie helped where she could, proud to be included in the preparations, dotting quiet moments. Mara found herself watching Caleb, the gentle way he explained things to Annie, his steady hands at work, the rare half-smile that sometimes crossed his face. He wasn't the husband she'd imagined for herself, but there was something reassuring about his solid presence. For his part, Caleb noticed how Mara had begun humming as she worked, how she'd taken to leaving a lamp burning for him when he came. And late from chores. Small things, but they spoke of home in a way his cabin hadn't known before. By the second evening, the roof was sound. The livestock had fresh hay stored under cover, and provisions were packed. They sat together at supper, the warmth of the stove keeping the mountain chill at bay. Annie chattered about checking their snares one last time before leaving, while Mara and Caleb shared a look of quiet understanding. Tomorrow they would start their journey, not just for the treaty papers, but toward whatever future they might build together. The risk ahead weighed on them both, but neither spoke of it. Instead, they focused on the practical tasks at hand, their shared work building a bridge across the uncertainty between them. As Annie dozed by the fire and Mara mended travel clothes, Caleb cleaned his rifle and checked their supplies one final time. The lamp burned low, casting their shadows on the walls, no longer three separate figures, but the beginning of a family. Frost sparkled like scattered diamonds across the yard as dawn broke over the mountain homestead. Caleb's breath clouded in the crisp air while he hitched the team to the wagon. The horses stamped their hooves against the cold, their flanks steaming in the pale light. Mara emerged from the cabin carrying a stack of quilts, Annie trailing behind with her small cloth doll clutched tight. Together, they arranged the wagon bed, creating a nest of blankets where Annie could stay warm during the long journey. Caleb packed their provisions methodically: coffee beans wrapped in oilcloth, sacks of oats for both horses and humans, strips of dried venison and beef jerky, stored in canvas bags. "Best get moving before the sun climbs too high," Caleb said, helping Mara and Annie onto the wagon seat. He wrapped an extra blanket around Annie's shoulders, tucking it secure against the morning chill. The wagon wheels creaked as they pulled away from the cabin. Mara glanced back at their home, worry creasing her brow. 3 days was a long time to leave it unattended, but they had no choice. The future of the spring and all who depended on it hung on finding those treaty papers. Trail wound down from the highlands, following old stagecoach tracks that had carved deep ruts into the earth. The wagon jolted and swayed as Caleb guided the team carefully around the worst spots. Annie dozed against her mother's side, lulled by the steady motion. By midday, they'd covered less ground than Caleb hoped. The rutted trail slowed their pace, more than expected. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and share a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Annie stretched her legs, exploring the immediate area under Mara's watchful eye while Caleb checked the wagon wheels for signs of stress. As afternoon faded toward evening, Caleb steered them toward a sheltered spot near a half-frozen stream. The water still ran clear beneath a thin crust of ice, providing for both horses and travelers. While Mara set up their camp, Caleb gathered firewood and soon had flames crackling in a stone-ringed pit. Annie helped her mother lay out their bedrolls before curling up in her nest of quilts, exhausted from the day's travel. Soon her steady breathing joined the quiet chorus of night sounds, the snap of burning wood, the gentle movement of hobbled horses, the distant call of an owl. Mara and Caleb sat close to the fire, sharing coffee from tin cups. The flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as silence stretched comfortable between them. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low to avoid waking Annie. "Spent 15 years in these mountains," he said, staring into the fire. "Trapping, scouting, living off whatever the land provided. Never thought I'd want more than that." Mara wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "And now?" Now double quotes. He paused, considering. Reckon a man can get tired of being alone. Mara nodded slowly. I had such dreams when I first married, she admitted. Imagined a busy ranch house full of children's laughter. Thought I'd grow old watching them raise families of their own. She glanced at Annie's sleeping form. Life had other plans. Still might, Caleb said quietly. Dreams don't always die. Sometimes they just need replanting. Morning brought another day of slow travel. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost and turning the trail muddy in places. They were forced to stop often, letting the horses rest on particularly difficult stretches. Near midday, they heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. Caleb tensed, one hand moving closer to the colt at his hip. A rider appeared around the bend one. Of Berriman's men, his vest marked with the cattle baron's brand. The man reined his horse alongside their wagon, his eyes sliding over their supplies and lingering on the rifle propped against the seat. Long way from home, he drawled. Heading to the county seat, are you? Just traveling, Caleb answered. Evenly the rider's mouth, twisted in an ugly smile. Friendly advice. Folks who keep clear of the courthouse tend to have easier lives. Shame if something happened to your fine wagon. Or your family. Caleb's hand hovered near his holster, but he kept his voice steady. Much obliged for the concern. We'll keep it in mind. The man touched his hat brim in mock politeness and spurred his horse onward. Mara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Annie pressed closer to her side, eyes wide with unspoken fear. He's gone now, Caleb assured them, though. His gaze remained fixed on the trail ahead. Won't be the last of Berriman's men we see, I expect. They pushed on through the afternoon, making up time on better stretches of road. The sun was setting when they finally caught sight of the county seat, a larger town than Elk Crossing, with actual wooden sidewalks and a brick courthouse rising above the other buildings. Caleb guided the wagon down the main street as dusk settled over the town. Oil lamps were being lit in shop windows, and somewhere a church bell told the evening hour. They had arrived, but the real challenge still lay ahead, gaining access to those treaty papers that might save the spring, and with it, the future. They were starting to build together. The brick courthouse cast a long shadow over the muddy street, its weathered columns rising 3 stories into the gray morning sky. Caleb helped Mara and Annie down from the wagon, his boots squelching in the thick mud of the street. Annie clung to her mother's skirts, eyes wide at the imposing building. Inside, oil lamps cast a dim glow over polished wooden benches and worn floorboards. The deputy's desk sat near the entrance, papers scattered across its surface. He barely looked up as they approached, continuing to scratch away with his pen. Need to see the treaty records, Caleb said, keeping his voice steady and polite. The ones concerning water rights in Elk Crossing territory. The deputy finally raised his head, revealing a thin face with suspicious eyes. Archives are locked. No public access without proper authorization. This concerns legal property rights, Caleb pressed. Surely citizens have the right to, said they're locked. The deputy cut him off. Nothing more to discuss. He returned to his paperwork, dismissing them entirely. Mara stepped forward, about to speak, when movement near the door caught their attention. Nanton appeared silently, as if materializing from the shadows. His presence drew sharp looks from others in the courthouse, but he moved with quiet dignity to Caleb's side. Without a word, he pressed a folded paper into Caleb's hand, then touched 2 fingers to his hat brim in greeting before slipping away as quietly as he'd come. Caleb carefully unfolded the note, angling it so Mara could read alongside him. Written in neat script were 2 names, Elijah Toller and Sarah Whitman, followed by the words honest clerks and morning shift. Let's find a place to rest, Caleb said softly. Start fresh tomorrow. They secured a room at Wilson's boarding house, a narrow 3-story building with creaking stairs and faded wallpaper. The room was small but clean, with a brass bed for Mara and Annie and a cot for Caleb. A pot-bellied stove in the corner fought against the damp chill seeping through the windows as night fell. Annie's cough returned, sharp and painful in the moisture-heavy air. Mara paced the worn floorboards, rubbing her daughter's back as each coughing spell racked her small frame. "The damp's not good for her," Mara whispered after Annie finally fell into fitful sleep. "We shouldn't have brought her." Caleb stood at the window, watching occasional passers-by hurry through the darkened street below. "We'll finish this quick as we can," he promised. "One way or another, we'll have our answer tomorrow." Morning brought weak sunshine and the sound of wagon wheels on cobblestones. They found Elijah Toller at his desk in the records office, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He listened carefully to their situation, nodding occasionally as Caleb explained about the spring and the threatened water rights. "The treaty exists," Toller confirmed in a low voice, glancing toward the door. "I've seen it myself. It specifically protects certain water sources, including springs in that region." He removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief, "but it's locked in the vault now. Has been ever since Berryman started making inquiries. There must be some way to access it," Mara said, desperation edging into her voice. Toller shook his head. "Not without a judge's order, and Judge Matthews." He paused meaningfully. "Well, let's just say he's particular about which cases he chooses to hear." Annie tugged at her mother's sleeve, tired and confused by the adult conversation. Mara lifted her, settling the child on her hip despite her growing weight. "So we've come all this way for nothing," Caleb said, his jaw tight with frustration. "Not nothing," Toller corrected quietly. "You know the treaty exists. You know it protects your rights. That's something to build on, at least." But the knowledge felt hollow as they prepared for the journey home. Caleb loaded their supplies back into the wagon while Mara settled their boarding house bill. The disappointment hung heavy between them, unspoken but palpable. Annie sensed their mood, unusually quiet as Caleb helped her into the wagon. The morning sun did little to warm the air as they pulled away from the county seat, the courthouse's shadow seeming to follow them down the street. "What do we do now?" Mara asked softly, once the town had fallen behind them. Caleb clicked to the horses, guiding them carefully around a deep rut in the road. "We keep fighting," he said simply. "Different way, maybe, but we keep fighting." The wagon creaked beneath them, marking the beginning of their long journey home with no solution in sight, but with the weight of truth adding purpose to their steps. The treaty existed. Now they just had to find a way to prove it. The wagon wheels creaked through fresh snow, leaving deep tracks in the white blanket that covered the trail. Caleb hunched forward on the seat, shoulders tense as he guided the horses through the thickening weather. Beside him, Mara held Annie close, both wrapped in every blanket they could spare. Asterisk. "Storm's moving in faster than I'd hoped," Caleb said, squinting at the heavy gray clouds. The first flakes had started falling just hours after they'd left the county seat, and now the wind was picking up, driving the snow sideways. The horses plodded forward, their breath steaming in the cold air. Annie burrowed deeper into the blankets, her face pale against the dark wool. The disappointment of their failed mission weighed as heavy as the storm clouds above them. By mid-afternoon on the second day, the snow was ankle-deep on the trail. When the weathered sign for Peterson's trading post came into view, Caleb turned the wagon toward it without hesitation. "We'll rest here," he said, pulling up to the hitching post. "Get warm, maybe find some extra supplies." The trading post was a long log building with a tin roof and smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, the warmth of a pot-bellied stove, and the smell of coffee wrapped around them like a welcome embrace. Annie's cheeks began to pink up as she thought out Mr. Peterson, the trader, was weighing coffee beans for another customer when the door opened again. Nanton stepped in, shaking snow from his coat. His expression was grave as he caught Caleb's eye. "Friend," he said quietly, moving to where Caleb stood. "News from the north isn't good." Mara drew closer, Annie holding tight to her skirts. Nanton's dark eyes took in their tired faces before he continued. "Berryman's men are already at work," he said, "building fence posts around the spring. They're certain the land will be theirs when the debt comes due." Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "Moving awful fast for men who don't own it yet. They're counting on winning," Nanton said, "and they know speed makes it harder to stop them." While Mara bought supplies, extra coffee, beans, and dried beef, Caleb and Nanton spoke in low voices by the stove. Annie dozed in a chair, exhausted from the cold journey. "There might be another way," Nanton said finally, "but it will take time and proof." "Time we don't have," Caleb replied, but he listened intently as Nanton explained his thoughts. The sky was darkening when they left the trading post, though it was barely late afternoon. They made camp earlier than usual, finding shelter in the lee of a towering bluff that blocked the worst of the wind. Caleb got a fire going while Mara set up their camp, moving with the efficiency of growing experience. After a simple supper of beans and coffee, they huddled close to the flames. The snow had eased, but the night was bitter cold. Annie sat in Mara's lap, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fire dance. "Thank you," Mara said softly, looking at Caleb across the flames, "for not giving up." Most men would have turned back by now. Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying upward. "Ain't in my nature to give up," he said simply, "especially not when it matters." Annie's eyes were growing heavy, her head nodding against her mother's shoulder. As Mara shifted to make her more comfortable, the child stirred slightly. "Good night, Pa," she murmured, the words slipping out as natural as breathing before she drifted fully to sleep. Caleb's hands stilled on the fire stick. He glanced at the sleeping child, then at Mara, uncertainty clear in his expression. Had Annie meant to say it? Was she even awake enough to know what she'd said? Mara's eyes were bright in the firelight, but she said nothing, just held Annie closer and smiled softly at Caleb across the flames. They broke camp at first light the next morning, pushing through the snow-covered trail toward home. The sun was setting when they finally crested the last ridge, the cabin a dark shape against the purple sky. Smoke rose from the chimney, Nanton's doing, they knew. He often checked on places where he was welcome when owners were away. The horses seemed to gain energy at the sight of home, pulling the wagon the final distance with renewed strength. The cabin was untouched, everything exactly as they'd left it. Inside, they found the fire banked low but still warming the space, and fresh wood stacked by the stove. Caleb carried a sleeping Annie in while Mara lit the lamps. The familiar walls wrapped around them, solid and secure despite the threats that waited beyond them. Tomorrow they would face Berryman's fences and the fight for the spring. But tonight they were home, and for the moment, that was enough. A week crept by as winter tightened its grip on the mountain homestead. Morning frost turned to thick ice on the windows, and the wind whistled through every crack in the cabin's logs. Caleb spent his days hauling wood from the forest, the axe's rhythmic thunk echoing through the pines. His shoulders ached each evening, but the growing woodpile gave him satisfaction. Each log meant warmth for his new family. Inside the cabin, Mara stood at the heavy wooden table, guiding Annie's small hands as they worked flour into dough. "That's right, gentle-like," she said, smiling as Annie's tongue poked out in concentration. "Biscuits need a tender touch." "Like this, Mama?" Annie asked, her fingers covered in white dust as she pressed the dough. "Just perfect," Mara answered, watching the girl beam with pride. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and for a moment, the worries about the spring seemed far away. That afternoon, Caleb hitched up the wagon. "Gotta get these pelts to town before the snow comes," he said, securing the load. "Should be back by nightfall," Mara nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "Be careful on the trail." She watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend, then hurried Annie inside away from the biting wind. The sun was setting when the first pounding came at the door. Mara jumped, nearly dropping the pot she was stirring. Annie looked up. From her carved wooden bird, eyes wide with fear. "Open up," a rough voice demanded. "Got business with the widow Collins," Mara's heart hammered. She recognized the voice, one of Berryman's men. Under the bed, she whispered to Annie, who scurried to obey. Then she squared her shoulders and opened the door. 3 men stood on the porch, their breath steaming in the cold air. The leader, a scarred man named Tucker, thrust a paper at her. "Mr. Berryman's being generous," he growled. "Sign this. Give up claim to the spring, and he'll let you keep the cabin." Mara's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "That spring's protected by treaty. I won't sign anything." Tucker's face darkened. He shoved the door wider, forcing Mara to step back. "Ain't asking nice no more." His boots tracked mud across her clean floor as he advanced. "Sign it." "No." Mara lifted her chin, though her knees felt weak. "Get out of my home." The blow came fast, not a punch, but a hard shove that sent her stumbling against the table. Annie's terrified cry pierced the air as she bolted from under the bed. "Mama!" Tucker's laugh was ugly. "Last chance, woman. Get out." Mara's voice cracked as she gathered Annie close, feeling her daughter's violent trembling. "Have it your way." Tucker crumpled the paper and tossed it in the fire. "Boys, show her what happens to stubborn folks." They strode out, boots thundering on the porch. Mara rushed to the window just in time to see them approaching the barn with lit torches. "No!" she screamed, but they were already throwing the flames onto the hay-strewn roof. The dry wood caught quickly. Smoke billowed into the darkening sky as the men mounted up and rode away, their laughter carrying on the wind. Mara's mind raced. The creek. It wasn't completely frozen. "Annie, stay inside," she ordered, grabbing every bucket she could find. Her feet slipped on the icy path as she ran to the creek, broke through the thin ice, and hauled water back to the barn. Again and again she made the trip, throwing water on the flames, her arms aching and lungs burning from the smoke. The fire hissed and crackled, mocking her efforts. Just as she thought she was losing the battle, a section of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, but the falling beams smothered some of the flames. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the last ember died. Mara stood shaking, her dress soaked and frozen, staring at the ruined barn. Half the roof was gone, leaving the interior exposed to the bitter night air. When she stumbled back to the cabin, Annie's cough stopped her heart. The child huddled by the fire, her face flushed and eyes glassy. "Mama, I don't feel good," she whimpered. Mara gathered her close, feeling the heat radiating from her small body. "Oh, my sweet girl." She tucked Annie into bed with extra quilts, but the coughing grew worse as the night wore on. By the time Caleb's wagon rattled up, Annie was barely conscious, her breathing ragged and shallow. Caleb burst through the door, taking in the scene with one sweep of his eyes. Mara's wet clothes, Annie's fevered face, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. "What happened?" he demanded, dropping to his knees beside the bed. Mara's words tumbled out between sobs as she told him everything. His face grew darker with each detail, but when she mentioned Annie's fever, fear replaced the anger in his eyes. "She needs the doctor," he said, feeling Annie's burning forehead. Now, they wrapped Annie in every blanket they had, and placed her in the wagon. Caleb urged the horses as fast as he dared on the dark trail, while Mara held their daughter, whispering prayers into the night. Dr. Wilson opened his door to their frantic knocking, taking one look at Annie before ushering them inside. His examination was swift but thorough, his weathered face grave as he straightened up. "She needs medicine," he said firmly. "Strong stuff I don't keep here. Have to get it from town. Without it." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Mara clutched Caleb's arm, feeling his muscles tense under her fingers. The night stretched before them, full of danger and fear, while Annie's labored breathing filled the room like a ticking clock. The darkness before dawn wrapped the cabin in shadows. As Caleb prepared for his ride, his breath made white clouds in the frigid air while he tightened the saddle cinch on his mule. The sturdy animal stomped restlessly, sensing his urgency. Inside, Annie's coughing echoed through the thin walls. Caleb's jaw tightened as he checked his saddlebags one final time. He'd packed light, just jerky, coffee, and his old army revolver. Snow was starting to fall, thick flakes catching in his beard as he stepped back inside. Mara sat beside Annie's bed, pressing a cool cloth to the child's forehead. "The fever's still rising," she whispered, her face drawn with exhaustion. Caleb knelt beside them, his rough hand gentle as he touched Annie's cheek. "I'll be back with the medicine soon as I can." His voice was soft but carried the weight of a promise. Annie stirred, her eyes glassy. "Pa?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Something caught in Caleb's throat. He squeezed Annie's small hand before standing. "Keep her warm," he told Mara. "I'll ride hard." The snow was falling faster as he mounted up. The mule's hooves crunched through the fresh powder, leaving deep tracks as they set out. Wind whipped at Caleb's coat, but he barely felt the cold. His mind was fixed on two things: the medicine Annie needed and the papers that could save their land. The storm grew fiercer as they descended from the mountains. Visibility dropped to mere yards, but Caleb knew these trails like his own heartbeat. He urged the mule on, trusting the sure-footed animal to find safe passage through the treacherous terrain. Dawn was breaking as they clattered into Elk Crossing's empty streets. The storm had kept most folks indoors, but smoke rose from the doctor's office chimney. Dr. Wilson was waiting with the medicine, expensive pills in a small glass bottle. "Every 4 hours," the doctor instructed as Caleb counted out the money. "And keep her drinking water, even if she fights it." Caleb tucked the precious bottle into his inner coat pocket. Rather than turning straight back, he guided his mule toward the church. The fresh snow muffled their approach, and the small building looked almost ethereal in the storm's dim light. Reverend Pritchard was tending the pot-bellied stove when Caleb entered, shaking snow from his coat. The preacher took one look at his face and gestured to a chair. "Something's weighing on you, son." Caleb remained standing. "Merryman's men burned half my barn, scared my family. Now Annie's sick with fever." His fists clenched. "I aim to settle it." The Reverend's eyes were kind but firm. "With violence?" "With whatever it takes. Vengeance breeds more vengeance, Caleb." Pritchard moved closer, his voice gentle. "Justice, though, that's God's work. There's always a better way than bloodshed." Caleb stared out the frosted window. What if justice means breaking the law? The law of man isn't always the law of what's right. The Reverend placed a weathered hand on Caleb's shoulder. "But whatever you do it for healing, not hatred." The words followed Caleb back into the storm. He'd ridden barely a mile when a familiar figure emerged from the swirling snow. Nanton sat astride his paint horse, wrapped in a thick blanket, waiting. "The spirits bring us together, friend," Nanton said, raising his hand in greeting. Caleb reined in beside him. "You're far from your usual trails." Nanton's dark eyes were serious. "The storm keeps men inside, near their fires. Even those who guard courthouses. Understanding dawned on Caleb's face. You mean ... double quotes. The vault will never be less watched than now. Nanton gestured at the falling snow. Nature provides opportunities for those who watch carefully. It would be breaking in. To recover what was stolen through lies, Nanton shook his head. That is not theft. It is restoration. Caleb thought of Annie's fever, of Mara's frightened face, of the treaty that could protect not just their spring, but the water rights of many. When? Tonight. The storm will peak at sunset. I know a way through the back door. Learned it watching the clerks. Nanton turned his horse. I will meet you behind the courthouse at dusk. They parted ways, the snow quickly hiding their tracks. Caleb pressed his mule harder on the return journey, aware that every minute counted. The storm grew worse, but the animal seemed to sense his desperation, pushing through drifts that sometimes reached its chest. It was early afternoon when he finally reached the cabin. Inside, he found Mara singing softly to Annie, her voice raw with worry. The child's breathing was still labored, her small chest rising and falling too quickly. Caleb pulled out the medicine bottle with hands numbed from cold. Here, he said, measuring out the pills as the doctor had shown him. We need to get these into her. Together, they managed to rouse Annie enough to swallow the medicine with some water. Her skin burned against Caleb's fingers as he stroked her hair, waiting until she drifted back to sleep. In the kitchen, he told Mara everything, about Nanton's plan, about the chance to get the treaty papers. She listened silently, her hands gripping her shawl. It's dangerous, she finally said. Everything about this is dangerous. Caleb took her hands in his. But if we don't try, we lose it all. The spring, the land, maybe even Annie if we can't afford more medicine. Mara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. Then go. But promise me you'll come back safe. She pressed something into his palm, a small cross on a leather cord. Annie and I need you. Caleb's throat tightened as he slipped the cord around his neck. I promise, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He stepped back out into the storm, leaving Mara watching from the doorway, snow swirling between them like a veil. The winter storm howled like a hungry wolf as Caleb and Nanton guided their mounts through the darkness. Snow pelted their faces, but the same fierce weather that made travel miserable also covered their tracks almost instantly. Their horses' hooves made soft thuds in the deepening drifts, the sound muffled by the thick curtain of white. The spirits themselves hide our passage tonight, Nanton said quietly, his words nearly lost in the wind. Caleb pulled his scarf tighter around his face. The cross Mara had given him pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of what waited at home. They rode in silence after that, conserving energy as they pushed through the brutal conditions. The courthouse emerged from the storm like a ghost, its dark windows staring blindly into the night. They dismounted behind the building, securing their horses in a sheltered alley. Nanton moved first, checking the side window he'd observed the clerks using. His fingers found the latch. As I thought, he whispered. They never fix it properly. The window creaked softly as they eased it open. Caleb went through first, landing quietly on the wooden floor. He helped Nanton follow, then pulled out the small brass lantern they brought. The tiny flame cast long shadows across the empty courthouse. Their boots left wet prints as they crept toward the records room. The vault door stood like an iron sentinel in the corner. Caleb's hands, steady from years of setting delicate traps, made quick work of the lock using the skills he'd learned in his scouting days. Inside, rows of leather-bound documents filled shelf after shelf. The lantern light gleamed dully off brass fixtures as they searched methodically. Nanton's keen eyes scanned labels while Caleb kept watch at the door. Here, Nanton breathed after what felt like hours. He carefully pulled out a worn leather folder, its pages yellow with age. They spread the treaty document on a small table. The formal language was clear. The spring was protected for communal use, guaranteed to both settlers and native peoples. It could not be sold or seized by any private interest. Caleb's hands were rock steady as he copied the relevant section onto a fresh sheet of paper, making sure every word was exact. Nanton verified the copy, then helped return the original to its precise spot on the shelf. A floorboard creaked outside. Both men froze. The deputy's boots scraped across the floor, coming closer. Caleb doused the lantern. They pressed themselves against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps paused just outside the records room. Time stretched like cold molasses. Then the deputy moved on, his steps fading toward the front of the building. Caleb and Nen waited until they couldn't hear him anymore before slipping out of the vault. The window closed behind them without a sound. The storm swallowed them immediately, erasing any sign of their presence. Their horses waited patiently. Already dusted with fresh snowdot, the precious copy was secure in Caleb's inside pocket as they rode away from the courthouse. The wind seemed to push them along, hurrying them back into the anonymous safety of the blizzard. By morning, there would be no trace they had ever been there. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Caleb rode into Elk Crossing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that crunched under his horse's hooves. Main Street was quiet, with only a few early risers shoveling their porches or lighting fires in shop stoves. Reverend Pritchard waited on the courthouse steps, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Several townspeople had gathered nearby, drawn by word that something important was about to unfold. Among them stood Martha Wilson from the general store and old Tom Baker, who ran the livery. "Brother Stroud," the Reverend called softly. "Judge, Willard is already inside. He came early when I sent word you were coming." Caleb dismounted, his boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. The treaty copy was secure in his vest pocket, close to his heart. He nodded to the gathered folk, touched the brim of his hat in greeting. Inside the courthouse, Judge Willard sat at his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He was a lean man with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier. Justice. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "Mr. Stroud," the judge said, looking up. "Reverend Pritchard tells me you have something important regarding the Collins Spring matter." Caleb withdrew the carefully folded paper. "Yes, Your Honor. The original treaty protecting the spring. This here's a copy I made myself, word for word." The judge took the document, studying it in the morning light streaming through frost-covered windows. More townspeople filed in quietly, including several farmers who relied on the spring water for their livestock. Through the window, Caleb spotted a group of Dine families arriving, their blankets bright against the snow. "This seems to be in order," Judge Willard said finally. "The language is quite clear. The spring was indeed set aside for communal use." He reached for his pen. "I'm issuing an immediate injunction against Mr. Berryman's claim until we can hold a proper hearing." The scratch of his pen filled the quiet room. Outside, more voices joined the growing crowd. The judge was just pressing his seal to the document when the courthouse door burst open. Horace Berryman stormed in, face flushed red against his black wool coat. "What's the meaning of this?" he demanded. Two of his ranch hands lingered uncertainly in the doorway. Judge Willard stood slowly, his voice sharp as a razor. "Mr. Berryman, you will maintain proper decorum in this court, or you will find yourself facing contempt charges. Is that clear?" Berryman's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The spring claim is suspended," the judge continued. "This treaty copy shows clear protection for communal water rights. Any attempts to fence or restrict access will result in immediate legal consequences." Through the windows, Caleb could see more people gathering. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with dying families. Martha Wilson was passing out cups of hot coffee. The sight warmed him more than any fire could. "This isn't over," Berryman snarled, but his voice had lost its thunder. He turned on his heel and stalked out, his men scrambling to follow. "Thank you, Your Honor," Caleb said quietly. The judge nodded. "Justice may be slow sometimes, Mr. Stroud, but it usually finds its way. Give my regards to your family." Caleb's heart lifted at those words. Family. He had one now. Sure enough, the ride home seemed shorter than ever before, despite the deep snow. The cabin came into view just as the morning sun cleared the mountain peaks. Smoke rose straight and true from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the windows. Mara met him at the door, her eyes bright with hope. "Annie's fever broke just before dawn," she whispered. "She's been asking for you." Inside, wrapped in quilts by the fire, Annie sat up when she saw him. Her cheeks were pink now with health, instead of fever, and her eyes were clear. "Pa," she said softly, deliberately, reaching out her arms to him. "You came back." Caleb's throat tightened as he crossed the room and gathered her close. Over her head, he met Mara's gaze, saw the tears glinting in her eyes. Outside, the winter sun sparkled on untouched snow, and the spring flowed free and clear beneath the ice, protected now for all who needed it. Spring came to the mountains like a shy visitor, testing the air with tentative warmth. First the snow retreated to shadowed hollows, then green shoots pushed through the softening earth. The damaged barn stood as a reminder of winter's trials, its charred beams reaching toward the brightening sky. But the Strouds weren't alone in facing the task of rebuilding. Word spread through the valley that help was needed, and on a crisp March morning, wagons began arriving at dawn. Farmers who relied on the spring brought tools and lumber. Nanton led a group of dyne men skilled in construction, their horses stamping in the morning frost. "Many hands make light work," Nanton said, clasping Caleb's forearm in greeting. His eyes crinkled with warmth. "The spring gives life to all our families. This is how we show gratitude." For 2 weeks, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Women from neighboring homesteads brought fresh bread and stews, filling the cabin with savory aromas. Annie darted between groups of workers, carrying water and helping Mara serve meals to the tired men. The new barn rose steadily, stronger than before. Caleb worked alongside his neighbors, learning the dyne method of joining beams that would help the structure withstand mountain winds. During breaks, stories were shared in English and Navajo. Bridges built through shared labor and respect. As March melted into April, the last board was nailed in place. The fresh-cut pine gleamed golden in the spring sunshine, a testament to community spirit. Mara organized a celebration dinner, with tables set up in the yard under the warming sky. Children played while adults shared coffee and pie, conversations flowing easily between cultures that had found common ground. Now, on this bright April morning, peace settled over the homestead like a gentle blanket. The air carried the sweet scent of thawing earth and new growth. Mara knelt in the soft soil beside the cabin porch, carefully setting flower seedlings into holes she'd prepared. Her hair caught the sunlight, glinting with strands of copper that Caleb had never noticed before. In the meadow below, Annie's laughter rang out clear as a bell. She was playing a game with Nanton's children, their small figures darting through the new grass like bright birds. Their voices carried up the slope in a mix of English and Navajo words, the language of childhood transcending all barriers. Caleb leaned against the new fence, his eyes taking in the valley spread before him. The spring bubbled up from the earth, just visible in the distance, its waters catching the morning light. Free-flowing and protected now, it would continue to nurture both settlers and dyne families for generations to come. His gaze returned to Mara, watching as she patted soil around a young wildflower. Such a different scene from that rainy October night in Elk Crossing, when desperation had pushed them together. Yet somehow, that hasty decision had grown into something true and strong, like the spring itself finding its way through rocky ground. "Your daughter needed a father," he said quietly, the words carrying easily in the clear mountain air. Mara looked up, her hands stilling in the dark earth. "And I needed a family." For a moment, they held each other's gaze, measuring the distance. They'd traveled from strangers to something more. Then Mara stood, brushing soil from her skirts, and crossed to where he stood. Without hesitation, she slipped her hand into his, her fingers work roughened but warm. Together they watched Annie playing below, her hair flying free as she ran. The sound of her laughter floated up again, carrying with it all the promise of spring. Behind them, the eternal mountains stood guard, their snow-capped peaks catching the morning sun. The breeze stirred the young pines, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The spring flowed on, its waters a silver thread, binding together all who depended on it. Like the water finding its path through the valley, they had found their way to each other, not by careful planning, but by following the course that Providence had laid before them. Annie's voice called out, "Pa! Ma! Come see what we found." Her face was bright with joy, secure in the knowledge that she had a home, a father, and a future as steady as the mountains themselves. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.